Hello, Lou Hamilton from Audible Elegance here in Cincinnati, Ohio. We are located on Montgomery Road, a couple doors north of the original Montgomery Inn, and across the street from Montgomery Cyclery. And we're coming up on spring, so maybe it's time to have your bike tuned up. Tonight I'm going to talk about records again, and we're going to have our little friend here, the Riga P8, involved in this presentation, but it's not a presentation you're expecting. I was asked by a customer as to why is vinyl having a resurgence? And there are various stories about the sound quality and the texture and the feel and stuff. But what's real important is to understand why vinyl went away. And you have to understand that this had nothing to do with sound quality. This had to do with a lot of profitability. This also had a way of punishing those of us who wanted to sell records, and we were in fact a record retailer, from stop selling them. So you have to understand that a lot of artists, particularly in the 60s, negotiated for a contract, a royalty, so to speak, for their work, where they would get 10 cents or 20 cents, maybe 25 cents for every album that was produced, regardless of its price. Now, at the time those contracts were written, there was no consideration or acknowledgement of the existence of compact disc. And cassette, well, was very much in its infancy. I suppose there were contract amounts for 8-track tapes, because you can still find those with different bands on it. But when compact disc came along, it had certain convenience factors to it. Early compact discs were fairly miserable in their performance anyway, but that's another video for the future. But they could now sell an album rather for $5.99. They could get people to buy the exact same album now on compact disc, and early on the price of compact disc was $17.99, $18.99. And they were making a crap load of money. And guess what? People like the Beatles were still getting paid 25 cents an album. So the spread between what they had to pay the artist for the work that they created, I mean, I got Chet Atkins, I love Chet Atkins, and what the record labels could sell them for was this huge spread. Now, the other thing that happened during that same time, and even Dick Clark observed this, particularly of the 80s when compact disc was really going along, and he made this compact disc comment in the 90s, which was, what could the 80s be remembered for in music? And Dick Clark's observation was nothing. Maybe a couple artists here and there, but that's it. And the reason being is that the record label companies were making so much money printing stuff you already owned. And of course, if it was original vinyl, it sounded better anyway, as opposed to some of the reissues, and we talked about that in a video in the past. They didn't have to spend money on finding new talent, because they were already making money hand over fist on the compact disc. But wait, there's more. So we now have, actually I still have the letter from Philips where they sold cartridges, and in the letter they stated, we never expected to replace vinyl with the compact disc. The compact disc to them was kind of another offshoot of their cassette, which they also invented. It was another format and a way of doing things, but it took on its own life because the record labels could make a crap load of money, and that's the truth. So why did vinyl go away? Well, one of the things you can do to stop something from happening is souring the milk. I'm actually working with an insurance company right now, that's what they're trying to do to my wife, but that's another story. So what they did is, as the pressings went on, particularly in the 70s and 80s, the thickness of the vinyl became a bit lighter. Now, that wasn't the problem. I mean, are the 180 gram albums flat in these new reissues? Absolutely. There's no question about that. But the real problem became the convenience factor of manufacturing records. And of course, nobody wants to buy a record that is out of its plastic. And the quickest way of doing plastic, what was known as shrink wrap. And so they would shrink wrap the albums. And so they're nice and tight, and they would fit on the shelf, and you could touch them, and the jacket was perfect. The problem with shrink wrap is shrink wrap doesn't quit shrinking. So what it would do to an album is slowly warp it. Well, in the original days of selling vinyl, if you got a defective record, whether it's a scratch in manufacturing or it's warped, you could take it back to the distributor and get full credit as for a replacement album. It was inconvenient to get another one, but it was okay. That was part of selling the gig. Well, the first thing they did to really dry up vinyl in the marketplace so they no longer had to make this stuff, which is why it's kind of interesting they're having a hard time finding presses anymore, is they started putting a penalty on our returning defective product. So instead of getting all of our money back for something that was defective, it started out with we'd only get 80% back. So we would lose 20% of our investment on a defective product. And of course, there wasn't any guarantee that the next one I got wasn't also defective, which I lose another 20%. So they started souring the milk and making it less profitable for us. Now, when you sold an album for $5.99, $6.99, $7.99, if you made 50 or 75 cents on each sale, you were doing good. The music industry at this time was the only one where it would take its frontline product, brand new albums, and everybody would price them right to the floor. They made no money on them at all. What they were hoping you would do is buy the latest album from Bee Gees, Beatles, whoever, but you would go over and look at the back catalog, which is where they were making their money, because it was priced higher. There wasn't competition for the first seller of a brand new album. But then souring it by 20% wasn't enough. Within 6 months to a year, they changed that ratio to 50%. You don't want to get half of your money back if you bought a defective record. Now, mind you, they were also running these things around in semi-trucks that would get very hot, and these things were all in shrink wrap. So guess what happened? Okay, we started seeing more defectiveness. And ultimately, in the end, towards the last year and a half, if you bought a record as a retailer to sell the record and it was defective, guess what? You got nothing. It was your problem. So that's the way they dried up the availability of vinyl as compact disc became more and more widespread. But it was never about sound quality. It was always about the buck. And the story goes, if you want to know the story, follow the money. And that's how it went down. I was a record retailer. I want to explain what happened. Why is vinyl coming back today? Because nobody wants to buy CDs. So now there's money in selling vinyl. When you see albums being sold today, guess what? They're not in shrink wrap. They're in plastic bags, and you wind up unzipping them from the top and pulling it open, and it's open. That's why they're doing it that way, because it doesn't result in the warpage. Again, it was not an intent of the record manufacturers to make damaged records or sabotage the vinyl. It was a convenient way. Everybody thought it was cool to package them this way, and that's the effect. So if you come across older albums that are still packaged in the shrink wrap, keep in mind that there is a risk that it will be warped. May not. It all depends what's happened to the shrink wrap. But that's why the better albums were always in these sort of plastic bags as opposed to shrink wrap. So there we are. Good hunting. Enjoy the vinyl.